Is the space industry doing more harm than good? Welcome to the latest episode of E+T Off the Page, and today we're looking at whether the space sector is doing more harm than good, and I think most of us would agree that it is not. The space sector has brought untold technological riches with respect to communications, navigation, scientific research and much more. However, there are a number of ways in which the space sector is having worrying effects on the environment, down here as well as up there. In an article in the last issue by Teresa Pulterova, she uncovered one of these, the effect the Earth's atmosphere as satellites burn up on re-entry. And to discuss the issues I have, as always, my E+T colleagues, Jack Cloughren and Tanya Weaver, and supplying the expertise is our guest, Ray Fielding, who's UK Space Agency's Head of Sustainability. So welcome, Ray.
Thank you.
In some ways, it's welcome back to Ray, because you were the subject of our big interview in the March issue last year, which addressed some of the issues we hope to talk about today. And I think there are three major issues where the space sector is held responsible for potential environmental damage. That's rocket launches, space debris, and obsolete space equipment burning up on re-entry. But perhaps we could start in really general terms. Are environmental issues something the space sector has been a bit blasé about until recently?
I suppose, yes, that's a fair challenge, but you have to remember, until fairly recently, space has been done by institutional and national actors, so big space agencies, very limited launch cadence, very big but sparsity of missions. And now we're moving to a much more commercial, what we call a kind of a new space sector, where launch cadence is a lot more frequent, a lot more rapid. There's a lot more space companies, and they bring in a built-in knowledge of space sustainability, environmental awareness, and the importance of environmental legislation and having that whole ESG footprint covered. So, yes. Until recently, I would say environmental effects of space were not really considered. It was more about getting into space, having a successful launch, exploring the unknown. And now it's more and more in prominence and more importance. And to illustrate that point, the space agency's restructured itself. So until recently, space sustainability wasn't a priority. And now it's one of the 8 fundamental priorities of the space agency. So we've restructured ourselves around sustainability.
Well, that's great. Well, I'd like to come back to what the space agency is doing in this field. But first, that issue about more of the launches being with the private sector, and you saying that's a good thing in terms of environmental responsibility. I just instinctively think it would be a bad thing if there wasn't that governmental regulation. Do we really trust private companies to do anything other than protect their profits?
Well, of course, private companies are in business to make money, but we in the UK are looking very, very carefully about granting things such as launch licenses. The recent Virgin Atlantic launch that had to fill in extensive environmental impact assessment reports, and the new spaceport in Scotland also will be following that path. So if we launch from the UK, the environmental impact will be carefully and thoroughly studied before any launch takes place, and that has to be passed as a critical step before you get that launch license.
A couple of weeks back, maybe it was last week, there was an all-female flight carried out by Blue
Origin.
Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos's company, and one of the sort of PR lines from Blue Origin was that the rocket used like some kind of hydrogen fuel that effectively only emitted water vapor into the atmosphere, and it was therefore effectively a kind of climate neutral way of sending people into space. I don't know if you took a view on that or whether that is actually a climate neutral.
Well, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because water vapor, when it's up in the upper atmosphere, isn't neutral at all, is it? It's one of the things that it can reflect sunlight back. It's carbon dioxide and water vapor up in the upper atmosphere is a bad thing, isn't it?
It can be. That particular flight, hydrogen peroxide as an accelerator. Interestingly enough, the UK was one of the pioneers of that accelerant fuel back in the day with a Black Arrow, and it's also seen as a potential cleaner alternative to rocket fuel currently. So that's been looked at as part of the greener fuels for the green and sustainable footprint of a launch. So yes, it can have an effect. The effect, I don't think is fully known, but also you have to look at the cadence of launches. I mean, we're talking last year, there's 250 launches, I think, and a few unsuccessful ones. Compare that with 50,000 flights by aircraft a day, and how many car journeys a day. I mean, we have to put these into context. So yes, there could be a potential for pollution from a rocket launch. We're trying to mitigate that with greener fuels, and of course, if you're outputting water vapor, that's still a significant saving compared to, say, a kerosene-based system which produces soot into the upper atmosphere. But the launch cadence is still way down compared to your day-to-day movements of the rest of society.
But isn't it fair to say that while of course the number of space launches is dwarfed by any other form of transport, it is on a sort of per flight basis drastically worse for the environment than any other form of transport, even flying, which is probably the most.
I saw that a film of the old Apollos, and they were burning up 20 tons of fuel per second during launch. That's a lot of fuel, isn't it?
Yep, it's an enormous amount. They were extremely large vehicles. I think the effects need to be studied more. Part of the work that we're doing at the Space Agency is looking at the demise of satellites, and also looking at the effects of upper atmospheric chemistry of things like launches. We're working with the Department of Transport to look at some of the effects you just mentioned there, about what does high-level particulates, how does that interact with the upper atmosphere? Does it cause an albedo effect for cooling? Although, watching the news the other day, there are some initiatives going on to look at spraying high-level droplets to reflect atmospheric emissions, to try and do something about global warming. So there's a trade-off to be had there.
Yeah, we did a story on that.
Did you? Interesting. So all of these things need more information, especially the effects of incoming satellites. That's a concern at the moment.
So what is the UK Space Agency doing in terms of measuring the effects of, I'm talking specifically about rocket launches now. We can come back to the re-entry piece a bit later in the conversation. But just in terms of rocket launches, do we know, is there any global or national focus on the environmental effects, potential damages?
So we're still not having, apart from the Virgin Orbit launch, no rocket launches as yet. This is something we're going along the path of making sure you have got the environmental impact assessment form fully filled in. We're funding money and providing money and research for cleaner rocket fuels. A number of different fuels being developed, everything from potentially recycling plastics to produce fuel to other things like I mentioned, the hydrogen peroxide accelerant there. And we'll keep baselining as we go forward. I mean, this is, with it being a nascent capability for the UK, because we're not recognised or a leading launch provider, not yet, we're able to start from a clean slate, learn from others, and take best practice going forward.
Well, is it a clean slate? How geographically, how localized is the effects of a launch? Like, is the whole planet shrouded in the stratosphere by the results of aviation, all sorts of pollution and rocket launches as well? If we had a UK capability for launches, what would be the effects on the UK's environment?
So that's very hard to say, because in fact, all of our launches will be polar inclination. The latitude of various spaceports around the world depends on where they can actually launch into. So we are quite advantageously positioned to launch into polar. That's a desirable orbit commercially. Other countries are too, notably the launch site in Alaska, and there's one in New Zealand, and there might be a couple of others around the world.
Just a quick question. What's the benefit of polar launches in comparison to sort of equator-based launches?
It really depends on what you want your satellite to do. So if you want a revisit rate for Earth observation satellite, for instance, you want to be in a polar orbit, because you're able then to to map or image the entirety of the Earth's surface fairly simply over a fairly short window, say 7-day window.
Right. Okay.
And for communications, low Earth orbit communications satellites as well, that is advantageous to try and put them in different types of orbit to get that coverage.
I would have thought a polar orbit would only allow you to say observe the northern hemisphere.
No, because the polar orbit goes from north to south, so the satellite is going
Right.
from north to south, so you will cover the entirety of the Earth.
Right.
Again, it depends on other factors as well, but as the Earth rotates and spins, you will get that coverage.
Well, great. Thanks for clarifying.
Okay, so well, where are we with UK launch sites as it stands at the moment? Because there was it 7 that were sorry, Tanya, did you?
No, there's one in Scotland. I'm sure there's one in Scotland.
Well, I think there was
right?
2 at least 2 in Scotland. There was one in Caithness and one in Shetland.
Yep, a couple
Craigavik.
in Scotland. But I think there's another couple of viable sites across the UK as well, including, of course, Spaceport Cornwall. And I think Wales was being looked at too. I'm not an expert in the launch side, so forgive me if I get a few things mixed up here, although it is an interesting area. So they are hoping to progress, I believe, the end of this year for the first UK vertical launch. So that'll be quite an achievement.
And where will that be? Will that be the Caithness
Up in
one?
Scotland,
Yeah.
yeah.
You did write about that, although I don't remember so much about it. But
And this isn't. It won't have the capability of taking large satellites, will it? Or
That really depends on the launch provider. So there's a few potentials there, Orbex, RFA, for instance, and that depends on the size of the vehicle that they're trying to construct and launch from the site. Most satellites, in terms of, let's say, a Eutelsat satellite, X1 satellite, are actually fairly small. Obviously, the higher up you go, or the more complex satellite, the larger they get. So I don't think the spaceport will be looking at launching things into GEO, though. They might be on the phone later saying they actually are. But a typical Earth observation satellite or a LEO satellite for comms, it's absolutely fine. That could be launched from facilities up in Scotland or elsewhere in the UK.
you mentioned Orbex, and I was reading up about them earlier, and they call themselves the world's most environmentally friendly rocket, low carbon launch vehicle, and they're using bio LPG.
Yep, I think that's LPG recovered from using a Fischer-Tropsch process through other materials.
Okay, because I think they're planning to launch soon, as you said.
Yes,
end of the year.
end of the year, I believe. Yeah.
And when you say the most environmentally friendly, how does that compare to another rocket? Like, how much is it? The emissions, or
It's kind of hard to tell because
Yeah.
size and weight and
Okay.
different performance characteristics of a rocket. And I think they're also looking at the entirety of their supply chain
okay,
from all components in the rocket,
right, okay.
the structure of the rocket itself as well as the fueling of the rocket. So
Right, okay, so it's the whole-
the entirety of the launch pad will be considered in that kind of assessment. So it's me saying I don't know the answer to that question, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, I guess it's modular as well. Maybe it could be reused, or maybe that's the
I don't think those rockets are reusable at the moment.
Right, okay.
So obviously the US has a great lead in reusable rocketry technology using recovering the first stages. We're not there yet,
Okay.
but there are steps to these things, and successful launches hopefully will be lead to more reusable rockets in the future.
So yesterday, Tim Peake addressed Parliament in a parliamentary session. And in that session, they were talking about Starship, SpaceX's Starship, which is SpaceX's largest rocket. And they were talking about being able to send, eventually, possibly a kilo of material into space for only around $200 to $300. Well, that's the aim in the long run, which is incredibly cheap, obviously. And I think part of the reason they're able to make that so cheap is because the rocket's so large that the kind of overall launch costs are brought down. But I do also wonder if it does become that cheap, when that encourage more and more companies to send stuff into space, and it kind of escalates into a point where actually you're getting Starship launches every day, and then that could have a significant impact on the environment. and whether we should attempt to limit the number of launches in to perhaps those that are carrying instruments of scientific progress rather than, I don't know, Katy Perry wanting to promote her new tour.
Quite a lot to unpack there. Yes, the evolution of Starship, I think, will fundamentally change the landscape for space. That's without a doubt. And you look at the space shuttle launch costs, that was over $50,000 a kilo. And to go from that to $200 or less even, I've seen figures which go to $80 a kilo, means, technically your outfit could afford to send something into space should it pass licensing requirements. It's going to fundamentally revolutionize and change access to space. Now, how we do that, that's something we are pondering quite carefully. We're looking, it's not just the environmental impacts as well, it's on Earth, it's the environmental impacts in orbit. So we're looking at something, we've got a working title of called carrying capacity. How many satellites are too many satellites? And then what can we do to utilize satellites better, to use them again? Because currently satellites are one-shot items. You run out of fuel, you throw it away, even if it's perfectly usable. I mean, who would do that if, say, you had a high-value asset for in your own life, like your car? Once that runs out of fuel, you don't throw them away, do you? Or if it breaks down, you repair it. But we don't do that in space. So all of these things are a balance, and we don't quite know what that balance is yet.
Yeah, I was going to come back to what some of the solutions are, and reusability of satellites could be one of them. But just to round off on the launches thing at the moment, if I could go back to that question, are we doing anything about measuring? You can say that we've got a baseline. We haven't had any launches, so we've got a clear copybook at the moment. But has any work been done in Kazakhstan, or is it Gambia, or where the other launch sites are, to know what effect it could have on local and global environment?
So on the environmental high impact atmospheric chemistry, no. But when you apply for an operations license from the UK, no matter where you launch from, you have to ensure that our licensing body, the CAA, is satisfied that your launch is going to be as sustainable as possible. So that means also what's going to happen to the rocket. Is it on a safe trajectory which isn't going to shed bits all over the place? Is it going to leave a rocket body in, say, dangerous place in geostationary orbit? And so if you don't meet these quite tight assessments, you won't get an operations license to operate your satellite, even though you're not launching it from the UK. So plenty of work to be done, of course. There's a lot more understanding to be done on some of these high-level effects, because it's still a body of knowledge. Us, European Space Agency, NOAA, are trying to work through to understand more. But at the moment, we're trying to do the best we can in terms of baking sustainability into even the application to gain a license itself.
Okay, and if we move on then from the launches, we'll come back to the space debris, what happens when it's up there, but look at the re-entry side of it. What happens when stuff comes back through the atmosphere? And this was what Therese Bulldrover's article was about, was the ESA cluster satellite that came back to Earth, and they were trying to see what effects they thought it would have, because it's something that we know virtually nothing about at the moment, is it? And the way that a satellite might burn up and the particles that it might release again could reflect the sunlight. It could put things in the upper atmosphere that we don't want there on a permanent basis. So what do we know about this at the moment? So, are the UK Space Agency part of the ESA program that are looking at this as well?
So what do we know about the moment? Not a lot. Are we part of the program? Yes, we are. We have a national program as well. So what happens when a satellite comes into the atmosphere? Well, to gain an operation license and a launch license, you have to show you have a credible plan to dispose of your satellite. For instance, geostationary orbit, you push it into what's called a graveyard orbit, so it's out of the way of other satellites operating in that quite protected environment. For the lower orbits, you have to show that you're not just going to leave that satellite there. So currently, after 25 years, you have to make sure your satellite is deorbit, so you have a 25-year lifespan after the end of life of a satellite. Now, for LEO, that is done by disposing of the satellite into the atmosphere to either fully burn up or controlled in a way which doesn't cause damage. And there's something called IADC guidelines, Interagency Debris Committee guidelines, which specifies a number, which is a ground impact assessment. So 1 in 10,000, that's a casualty figure. You're not allowed to exceed that number. That sounds quite high, 1 in 10,000 chance of having a piece of space junk land on your head. It's actually quite low when you multiply that by the amount of people on the Earth. So it makes it 1 in a trillion that it's going to land on your head, as it were. So that's the plan for disposing of satellites. Now, what happens when your satellite fully burns up or burns up a little bit and re-enters is something we don't know. So is it a concern? I think it's a concern that we don't know the answer. So we don't know if it's a concern, but we know it's a concern to us because we don't know the answer. There's a possibility. We know that when aluminium, for instance, when that ablades, that has an interaction with ozone, which, the last thing we want to do is grow the satellite industry and grow the space sector and then have a negative effect on ozone. I mean, we've just recovered from the CFC debacle. That was the unknown there. So I would say we're at the stage now, we're at the same kind of level as a nascent CFC industry was back in the day, whenever that was, 40s, 50s, 60s. And we don't want to repeat the same kind of mistakes. So we need to understand what happens in terms of chemistry. So that mission you just mentioned, really, really interesting mission by ESA to look at using the disposal of those satellites. I believe they were in a highly elliptical orbit. So they controlled them. It's kind of an controlled re-entry into a spot in the Pacific Ocean. It's called a space graveyard. There's an official name for it, but it's basically the furthest point away from anywhere you try and bring a spacecraft down into. So again, minimizing that casualty risk. And that mission, if I remember correctly, they observed it from the plane to try and understand through high-powered instrumentation what happens to a satellite when it comes in. And you can do multiples with that, such as multispectral analysis and see what chemicals might be coming off. But we are going one step further, and we've invested with the European Space Agency to do a mission called Draco, which is going up in a couple of years, which is taking a kind of bulk standard everyman satellite, that size of a washing machine, launching it and then disposing of it right away. So that will be packed with instrumentation, packed with cameras on the inside, so we can actually see, for the first time ever, from the satellite's point of view, what's happening. Because we, at the Space Agency, I'll talk about what we're doing in a minute, but it's still that detailed knowledge about what's happening whilst a spacecraft is disintegrating is still an unknown. We don't know the size of the pieces, the fragments, the type of the fragments, how it might be spinning. All of these interactions with the atmosphere as a spacecraft comes in can complicate things no end.
And will Draco be made up of the same sort of materials that an ordinary satellite would
absolutely
be?
Yeah, absolutely. So spacecrafts tend to be made out of aluminium. If you've got high maneuverable spacecraft like some of the ones that I'm developing, they might have a titanium fuel tank, or even things like stainless steel. They have a high chance of re-entering, hence the guided re-entry, because some things do come back, and especially if you have heavy instrumentation of different metals, that does tend to come back. So hence the aiming for that space graveyard place in the Pacific. But the Draco mission will be made out of atypical small satellite construction, so aluminium frame, whatever might be on the solar panels, for instance, so we can try and get some more understanding about how all these things interact. Because yes, aluminium might ablade and cause damage to the ozone, but aluminium then combined with other materials, we've got no idea how that acts. It might not be a problem, but it might be a problem, and it's that unknown question we need to answer.
So, and you'll be able to recover what's left of Draco in the Pacific rather than let it sink to a graveyard at the bottom of it, presumably.
The instrumentation panel package will be on a recoverable re-entry vehicle of some description. I can't remember what it's going to be, but I imagine that'll be the kind of shield and parachute recovery, because we do need the information coming back. And as you know, coming back into the atmosphere, you do lose communications with the atmospheric burning effects. You do lose communication for that brief period, so we need to recover the instrumentation. So that'll be taken care of.
How much of, if you have a small mid-sized satellite that's maybe 300, 500 kilograms, I think that's what SALSA was, the one from the ESA cluster that they were studying. How much of that hits the Pacific? Or, how much is burnt up?
Well, what's left, kind of thing, once it actually hits sea level.
Yeah, that's it, Jack. Yeah, so how much, more importantly, how much is then burned up in the atmosphere?
Well, it really depends on what's on the satellite. Like I said, some of the lighter elements, aluminium and stuff, I'd expect to fully burn up. But if you've got any instrumentation package, now I don't know what was on that particular satellite. I know the UK had a lead role in producing some of the instruments, but it's the instrumentation packages on those kind of satellites which tend to survive because of the complex construction out of different materials to gain the scientific data you're trying to get. A typical Earth observation satellite, for instance, might not be of that kind of exotic material, so could well fully burn up. And things like Starlink tend to fully degrade in the atmosphere. I think there was a incidents only in January when about 40, 50 of them, I forget the exact number, but quite a few of the Starlink constellation came down at their end of life, and they burned up and provided a spectacular display across many areas people were watching.
I think there might have actually been a controlled re-entry because they were like generation 1 satellites that for some reason there might have been an issue with them and they needed to bring them down. But
yeah, and how many are we talking about at the moment? As I understand it, and I tried to look this up, but it's sufficiently vague, and I got on the internet as how many satellites there actually are. But it seems to be there's somewhere between about maybe about 8,500 active satellites, 3,000 in the end of life inactive satellites. Is that the right sort of?
Yeah, it varies every
number?
day with the launches, of course, and I can't keep track. So it does vary, but that's the right sort of ballpark, yeah.
So I'm wondering how many, if you're saying that they are meant to be decommissioned and burned back up in the atmosphere after 25 years, we're not talking about very many that are 25 years old, for example, at the moment. Are we burning up many at the moment?
So again, the question which is under consideration, especially when you look at the future number of satellites. To give some context, there's about 40,000 pieces of debris in orbit at the moment, which we're actively tracking. So UK has a service called the National Space Operations Centre. So we provide data to satellite operators every day. Us, along with our allies across the world, are tracking about 40,000 pieces of debris over 10 centimetres. And there's an estimated million pieces of debris, which is sub 10 centimetres. And there's sub 1 centimetre, millimetre, there's uncountable numbers almost. So it's a growing issue. And if you do the kind of projections along with what's happening with the ability to access space, we are estimating a minimum of 50,000 satellites in orbit by 2030.
Wow.
And that's a potentially conservative number. There's higher estimates than that too. But this is low-cost access to space, the ability for other people and non-space actors as suddenly you get access and launch constellations. Interest in space with investment as well for different services as space becomes more commercially focused. There will be a huge number of satellites going up, and then with the huge number of satellites going up, the correspondingly potentially huge number of satellites coming down after they reach the end of life.
But my point is that there's a delay on that, and so those ones aren't coming down yet. But again, 20, 30, 40 years, we're going to have a huge amount that we need to coming back into the atmosphere, and it will
potentially
become an issue.
Potentially sooner. So we operate on a 25-year end of life. underneath our regulatory regime. We're reviewing that at the moment to see if we need to bring that down, because these things were put in place when there's comparatively few operators, and they tended to be more up in GEO. The LEO constellations were not as developed as they are now. All that's changed. And the FCC, the American Federal Communications, can't remember the exact acronym, but they've now mandated a 5-year lifespan for their end of life for the satellites. So things like Kuiper, the Amazon network, they'll be on 5 years to remove their satellites, not the 25 years which was standard. So,
And does that apply retroactively to satellites already in space?
no, they
Only to new
only
launches.
to new launches, yeah. But that bow wave of 25, 30 years you've just mentioned there could be considerably sooner if that 5-year ruling is then applied to future launches from the US and US operated satellites, and other nations follow suit. And ESA is looking at bringing their end of life guidance down as well, although they, being an institutional operator, have comparatively fewer satellites than some of the commercial operators.
But is there a concern because you need international cooperation on these kind of rules? Because I mean, basically any country of significant size or wealth can launch into space, so you need kind of international cooperation. But from a commercial perspective, I would imagine Amazon, for example, would prefer their satellites did stay up in orbit for 25 years and not for 5 years. So what stops a firm like Amazon going to, say, Russia, who have already got a track record of launches, and Russia saying, we're not interested in following the international guidance on this? Is there a concern about possibly rogue states such as Russia bending the rules or just having completely different rules?
There is, but that can be combated in a number of ways. So you need a launch license, and you need an operator's license as well. So I hate to use the example of Amazon because it's a big company full of lawyers. But for instance, if Amazon wanted to do that, and I'm not saying at all that they would,
Of course not.
they would then run into trouble with their operations license. So although they could gain a launch license from a rogue state and launch their satellites away, how do they then operate them? And the operating license regime has sustainability built in. We do. I believe the Americans as well addressed that. I can't remember the company it was, but there was a company who couldn't get a license in the US, so they went to India and launched there, and then got heavily fined for doing so. So there are mechanisms to try and stop that happening, to stop and there's also something which is being looked at. The FCC have looked at it, and we're looking at it as well, in market denial. So if you don't operate your satellites in a correct way, in a safe way, in a sustainability way, you don't get the market access. You can't provide those services to the company, the country. And denial of service into a country that's denying a company to make money, isn't it? So that's a big driver for positive behavior. But there again, you have a potential there where you have a rogue satellite operator who completely offshores to a rogue state. So international cooperation, as you said, is the key to making sure this is a worldwide policy going forward.
Okay. If I can move the conversation onto the space debris piece. So that's where we've looked at the environment down in Earth and the atmosphere, but now we've got the environment up there as it were. And you mentioned there was something like 40,000 pieces above 10 centimeters, and maybe 1 million in the 1 to 10 centimeter range. And I believe that a 2 centimeter piece of metal can take out a satellite because of the speeds that it's traveling at. But it doesn't seem to happen, does it? Or does it? I'm not aware of there being any instances when we've said, "Oh, the satellite's been taken out, so we can't provide service."
Or just as a quick addition to that, I do remember, I think it was about 10 years ago, but they believe a paint chip hit one of the bulkheads on the ISS, and you can see a picture of that, and it's like a thick chunk of metal, and it's got a massive dent in it. I seem to remember they were saying it was presumed to be a paint chip. Having said that, since then I've not heard of any other damage occurring to the ISS. So,
Well, I was just going to say about not damage, but I read some of that Starlink. So last year I had to do 50,000 maneuvers to maneuver away from space debris about to hit their satellites. And of course, while they're doing that, they're not doing their communications while they're doing their maneuvers away. So, and that's low Earth orbit, or LEO, which is becoming incredibly congested.
Yes, Leo is an orbit of concern, and all of those things you just mentioned are a concern and growing possibilities. The space shuttle as well, this is going back a while ago now, had a paint fleck hit the windscreen of the space shuttle and caused damage there. So it's been an ongoing problem for a while. The Russian space station, I think it was the Mir, was inspected and found to be absolutely peppered with impacts, including the solar panels. And sometimes satellites just stop working. We don't know why. And there's a school of thought which is the impacts they receive, whether it be from micro debris or even larger debris, although the spacecraft might not break up, it might be degraded in such a way that it's no longer functional, and we just don't know why. It would be with the new generation of remote proximity operation capable vehicles we're developing, we'll be able to go and inspect some of these satellites and find exactly what's happening, but you just physically can't see what's happening at the moment. We don't have that capability in orbit to inspect satellites, but yeah, it's certainly a growing problem. And what you mentioned there is something we call conjunctions, where it's either spacecraft heading towards each other or need to maneuver, or space debris, which is an increasing and very, very, very common event. And as I mentioned, satellites have one tank of fuel. So once that's expended, these satellites then non-operational. It's no good anymore. So the more you got to move it, the more you expend the lifetime of your satellite. So a satellite with a 5-year lifespan might be significantly degraded with no capability to refuel as yet, going down from 5 years to 4, 3, whatever it might be. And that costs money. You have to replace it, and that eats into your margin. So it's bad all round, really.
Well, I suppose on that point, like, could we talk about the possibility of refueling satellites in orbit? I mean, I think there has been some research done into it. Do you know how far that's progressed at the moment?
I do, because it's sitting on my desk. So the Space Agency is doing a number of things, but if you look at orbital refueling, this has been done for a long, long time. For instance, the ISS, that needs refueling. That's flying fairly low, so it needs to keep boosting up to make sure it doesn't degrade through the atmospheric drag process. So these techniques have been around for a while, but not in the UK, obviously. But what we are is one of the world's leaders in autonomous operations for satellites. We've got one launching next year to dock onto a satellite and remove it. But that technology then unlocks other things. So that's my other role as ISAM, in orbit servicing, assembly and manufacturing, to look at that servicing aspect in orbit, which includes refueling. Because if you can dock with a satellite to remove it, you can refuel it, you can repair it, you can maintain it, you can extend its lifespan. And whether that be then suitable for the current operator, I mean, they might want to replace it for obsolescence, to move to a better capability. That might be one thing, but also, second-hand cars is quite a big market, isn't it? But why not second-hand satellites, especially for the people who might not be able to create them themselves or afford to buy them brand new? Sell on a second-hand satellite, refueled and good to go again for another few years. That might be beneficial instead of just throwing it away.
Well, so you just do like a software update and suddenly that satellite's providing data to a completely different company.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I've had some tentative inquiries from other operators around the world who are not into the satellite game, don't know how to produce a satellite, but interested in, is there a second-hand satellite for sale? I've actually been asked that question a number of times. So there's potential there. I don't know if it's going to be a big market, of course, but it's got to be better than the current situation where we just throw them away.
Yeah, it seems mad, really.
Yeah. And if you want things like Earth observation data, it's in different resolutions. Take, for instance, if 1 meter resolution is useful, then the instruments, no matter how old they are, as long as they can provide 1 meter resolution, are still going to be useful to somebody. So if you can extend the life of that, it's money in your pocket, isn't it? As long as the service can be provided cheaper than replacing the satellite, and that's the key at the moment. So that's why the government steps in to take away some of the risk and de-risk the technology, because it's still an expensive exercise at the moment.
Just going back to the space debris argument, and then we can have a few minutes just talking about solutions like that one. Where are we at the moment? Because as Tanya was saying, the congestion in LEO could get ridiculous. There's something called the Kessler syndrome. Is that right?
Yes, Kessler effect, that is a concern, and that is about the cascade effect from debris hitting debris, creating more debris. Really well illustrated, although they got it a little bit backwards, but in the film Gravity, where you see a satellite destroying, a spacecraft accident destroying something, which leads to more damage, So the Kessler effect, there's a variety of possibilities or impacts. I suppose the least bad Kessler effect would be denial of certain orbits. So an orbital shell is lost. For instance, different satellite operators like to operate in different orbits. Starlink is 500 and something kilometers, I believe, and then the Eutelsat OneWeb's about 1100. So that's their preferred orbits to give the coverage for their market. So if a debris effect happens and has hundreds or thousands of flying particles in those orbits, then that becomes dangerous to operate in.
And they stay at Earth. They don't lose their orbit over time.
So they do, yeah. So there's atmospheric drag. The atmosphere extends way, way, way. I'm not an atmospheric chemist, but it goes on, way past 1,000 kilometers. So there's different effects of atmospheric drag. Most satellites, which are in LEO, then in fact, all satellites, unless they are designed for a very, very short life, they will get caught in the atmospheric drag and be pulled into the atmosphere. Now that can be as short as a few months for a really low-flying CubeSat, for instance, or it could be hundreds of years for higher up, over 1,000 kilometers. But it will happen. The higher you go, of course, it lessens the effect to the point where it becomes 10,000 years, 100, meaningless. But certainly for LEO, that still can be done. So the pieces could be pulled back into the atmosphere. It's a question of when. The last thing you want to do is have an orbital shell lost for tens or hundreds of years, because that then creates all sorts of problems and you don't get the benefit of that operation. But the worst effect of Kessler syndrome would be that a shell would be created around the Earth at an altitude means it's dangerous to actually leave the Earth.
You can't.
So you're then trapped. You can't launch at all, and you can't even launch to try and clear up the problem. So I don't know what we do in those sort of situations, but hopefully.
Well, how far away are we from that? Because if everything is gradually pulled back because of the atmospheric drag, then it's not just shells at 1,000 kilometers or 500 kilometers. The shell merges into one, doesn't it? And it becomes this huge.
Yeah, and it really depends on the size of the piece, the mass of the piece, and what the debris is made of. It's all different rates. I mean, that's happening right now. Smaller pieces being pulled back, but the smaller pieces tend to degrade a little bit faster than the bigger pieces, and we've got a concern at the moment with some of the larger objects up there. There's the Forbes top 50 pieces of space debris. It's an interesting but quite relevant report on the potentials of large pieces intersecting. It's these large pieces which are of concern because they create many hundreds, if not thousands, of fragments. And there's another piece of work done by a company called Leo Labs called the bad neighborhoods, where you have multiple objects which are kind of close to each other, and there's an increasing possibility. For instance, the bad neighborhoods I saw about 2 rocket bodies which have over a 20% chance of colliding in the next few years. And as you extend time, only for the next 10 years or so, that increases to over 30% chance of hitting and then causing that big fragmentation effect. So I can't tell you exactly when Kessler effect may happen, but I do know that it's a matter of time before another orbital fragmentation effect happens.
Okay, well, we're nearly out of time, but we haven't address too much because some of the solutions we talk with launches about sustainable rocket fuels and that sort of thing, and studying the re-entry. But what sort of solutions are you looking at for cleaning up space?
So a variety. We are developing a core technology called RPO, Remote Rendezvous Proximity Operations, that gives a satellite precise maneuvering ability to do what you're not supposed to do with satellites, which is fly them into each other and safely dock. We've got a mission going up next year with the European Space Agency, but funded by Astroscale and a UK ESA as well. It's called ELSA-M. That will dock onto defunct OneWeb satellites and remove that from orbit. Also investing in technology by a company called ClearSpace to physically grab hold of a small satellite and then remove that into the atmosphere and to be safely disposed of.
Can I ask about that? Are all satellites moving? A really stupid question, I apologize, but are all satellites moving in more or less the same direction? You're talking about polar satellites, so they're going
All over
pole
the
to
place.
pole.
Yeah.
So how can you grab something? Because these are traveling at sort of 18,000 miles an hour or something.
They are, but it's all relative. All relative. Say for instance, if you're in a car, you'll do 70 miles an hour. The speed of you reaching over to grab something from the passenger seat is relatively slow, but your hand's doing 70 miles an hour. So it's a relative in orbit against each other. So as long as you can match the orbital speed and velocity and direction of the satellite and do it precisely, this is the key, the precise control, you can dock with another satellite. And we are looking to fund a UK mission, National Active Debris Removal Mission, to remove 2 satellites and do it repeatedly. So the current missions are looking at just removing 1, and then the services might, and it's the ClearSpace one, will be disposed of. What we're going to do is a demonstrator service. So it removes the satellite, comes back on station, grabs another one, removes that, and then comes back on station. So demonstrator service to try and do something about space junk, do something about defunct satellites, help space sustainability, but also prove that technology, because once you've proved that technology, so you can grab hold of a satellite safely, you can refuel a satellite, you can repair it, you can move it, all of those other possibilities then become open to you.
It's if you're looking at cleaning up all of those 40,000 bits floating around in space, it's got many missions to do all that, though, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not just the satellites we're looking at to do the big removal missions. Obviously, you need a big, fairly substantial satellite to remove a large piece of space debris, like a rocket body or a dead satellite. But there's other solutions as well, such as pushing with a laser. So light has a force, and if you can target from space some of these pieces of space debris, you can push them into the atmosphere and make sure they're removed speedily, or at least change their course so they get atmospheric drag, and changes the lifespan which they'll be in space for. So there are other solutions.
Is that technology we could use for asteroids that are going to wipe out humanity in the future?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I have no idea. Suppose it depends on the when you intercept the asteroid, how far away, and mass and such. There's a little bit around my knowledge right there.
All right, Ray, thank you. That's terrific. Unfortunately, we've completely run out of time. So from this episode of Off the Page, that's us for today. The rest of the series you can see on the website, YouTube, or wherever else you source your podcast from. In the meantime, thank you very much to our special guest, Ray Fielding, who I presume can be contacted through the UK Space Agency's website. And in the meantime, thank you all for listening. Goodbye.